In 2000, a man's body was found floating in a river in Poland, hands bound, starved, tortured. For years, the case went cold, until investigators stumbled across a bizarre, violent novel written by a man halfway across the world. And when they opened that book, what they read completely flipped the investigation on its head. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. On the morning of December 10th, 2000, the Odra River, which flows through western Poland, looked like any other sleepy winter stretch of Polish countryside. 3 friends were out fishing near the city of Wrocław, bundled in layers, casting lines into the murky water, not expecting much more than cold fingers on a quiet day. Then, one of them noticed it, something drifting just near the shoreline. At first, he figured it was debris, an old log maybe, or some waterlogged rubbish. This river coughed up all sorts of things, but as he stepped closer, something felt wrong. The shape wasn't quite right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it didn't float like wood, it didn't sink like rubbish. He called over to one of the others, and the second man, a little baffled, grabbed his fishing rod and gave it a gentle prod. The object shifted slightly, and what bobbed to the surface made them all just kind of stop. It was a human body, bloated, pale, and clearly dead. They immediately began to try and make sense of what they were seeing. Maybe an accident, a tragic slip. People fell into rivers all the time. They called emergency services, and by the time police arrived, the body had drifted closer to the bank. It was a man, his face almost unrecognisable from the water and time, half-dressed but lifeless, his form beginning to stiffen in the icy current. The officers fished him out carefully, already bracing themselves for the paperwork of another unfortunate drowning. But when they saw the rope wrapped around him, that changed. This wasn't an accident. The man's hands were bound tightly behind his back, and a noose was cinched around his neck. Even more disturbing, the rope from his neck was connected to his wrists. It formed what investigators later described as a backward cradle, one that it basically meant even the slightest movement, even breathing, could have triggered the noose to tighten, slowly but fatally. Whoever did this had designed it to kill, not quickly, but deliberately. And it got worse. The body was taken for a full autopsy. What the pathologists discovered was chilling. The man had been starved for days before his death. His stomach was empty. It was clear that his body was incredibly weak. And there was water in his lungs, which meant he must have still been alive when he hit the river. But the autopsy also found there were signs of ligature strangulation, so it indicated that he might have started dying long before the water then kind of finished the job. In the end, the cause of death was left undetermined because of this. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure this man suffered, and for now, nobody even knew who he was. There was no wallet, no phone, no ID, nothing to suggest who this man was, where he'd come from, or who might be missing him. His face was bloated, distorted by however long he'd been in the current. And his sweater, it was partially intact, but it really didn't offer much in the way of identification. Very standard, very unremarkable, the kind of thing half the men in Wrocław might have worn on a chilly November day. The investigators had a body, but no name. And that was a problem, because without a name, there was no motive, no timeline, no suspects, just a brutal, intentional murder committed in silence. The officers combed through local missing persons reports, but there were no obvious matches, until one detective, scanning a recent bulletin, paused. There was something about this case, something eerily familiar. There had been a report filed nearly 4 weeks earlier, A woman had called in, distraught, saying her husband had never come home. He'd last been seen leaving his office, an advertising firm in downtown Wrocław, on November 13th. Since then, radio silence. No sightings, no phone calls, no activity on his bank accounts. His name was Dariusz Januszewski. The officer squinted at the details of the missing persons report, then back at the autopsy photos. The height, the build, the hair, the age, it all lined up. Of course, that's not confirmation yet, but it really was the first real lead that they had, and if it was true, the investigation had just shifted dramatically. This man was a local businessman. He was a husband, an entrepreneur who had very randomly vanished in broad daylight from the heart of the city. If this was Dariusz, the case had gone from this kind of anonymous horror to something much, much more personal. And somewhere out there was a killer who had nearly gotten away with it. Before he was a body in the river, Dariusz Januszewski was just a man who left work one afternoon and never came home. When he was first reported missing, police did what they always do. They started with the people closest to him. That was his wife, his mother, his employees, but there was no clear reason why a well-liked, successful advertising executive would simply vanish. Of course, in this case, they do have to consider the fact that this person might have wanted to voluntarily leave, but nothing in this case pointed to that. He hadn't taken anything with him. It just didn't seem likely. But there was one thing that really stuck out to investigators. One strange, unnerving detail that wouldn't make much sense until later. Dariusz's mother worked for him. She was his bookkeeper, and on the day he disappeared, she'd answered a phone call that had stuck with her, and this is the kind of one specific, unnerving detail. It was just after 9:30 a.m, and a man's voice came down the line, urgent and abrupt. He asked, quote, "Could you make 3 signs? Quite big ones, the third one as big as a billboard." When she asked for more information, the man's tone shifted. He snapped that he was not going to talk to her about this. He demanded he be put through to Dariusz. But Dariusz wasn't in the office yet. So she gave the caller her son's mobile number. And then, just like that, the man hung up. No name, no company, no contact details, just the faint sound of, and this is a quote from what the mother heard, background noise, a dull roar, maybe traffic or machinery, and a voice that she later said sounded professional. That afternoon, when Dariusz finally came in, she did mention the call, and he seemed really unfazed. He told her that, yeah, he'd got that call on his mobile phone and he was meeting with the caller later, but that would be the last time she saw her son alive. According to the office receptionist, Dariusz left work at 4 p.m. He didn't say where he was going, but the oddest detail was that he left his car in the car park. And for anyone that knew him, that was a massive red flag. Dariusz always drove to client meetings, always. It wasn't just habit, it was routine, predictable. But not that day. And to be honest, we do get answers at the end of this case, and that's something that I still can't quite work out as to why his car was still there. But as you'll come to learn, there are still a couple of spots here where we just don't have the exact answers or the exact detail, and this is one of them. Chances are he probably got picked up. But anyway, back to the current time in the investigation, and the receptionist told police that she had seen something else. As Dariusz had walked away that day, the last day he was seen alive, she thought she saw 2 men following him. She didn't know who they were, and she couldn't really describe them clearly. She just got a glimpse, but it was enough to give investigators something to think about, because if that was true, Dariusz might have been walking into a trap. And whoever set it probably didn't work alone. Dariusz was over 6 foot tall. He weighed nearly 200 pounds. He was not an easy man to overpower, especially not without a fight. So the thought began to take root in detectives' minds that maybe this wasn't the work of one person. Maybe this had been some kind of team. Weeks later, When the body was found and the police had their suspicions, they needed someone to make the final identification, because up to this point, they had this missing persons report, they had this body, and they had a theory, but they really needed it to be confirmed for sure. And so they called Darius's wife. But when she arrived at the morgue, she just broke down. She could not bring herself to look at him. And so his mother, who was also there, stepped in. She stared at the bloated, water-damaged body, and after a moment, nodded. She recognised the long, flowing hair, and on his chest, a familiar birthmark. It was her son. So now, it was time to find out who had called the office, who Darius had gone to meet, and why he never came back. Divers were sent to the icy black waters of the Odra River, hoping to recover more evidence, maybe a weapon, maybe clothing, maybe some trace of the people who left him there. But they found nothing. Forensic teams swept the shoreline and combed through the nearby banks looking for footprints, drag marks, tyre treads, anything that could tell them where he'd been killed or how he'd gotten to the water. But again, nothing. So they pivoted and turned their attention to the man himself. They searched through his home, his business, and his life. And what they found was just kind of nothingy. No debts, no criminal ties, no shady friends. His advertising firm was small but steady, and the accounts were clean, the books balanced. But there was one thing that gave police a sliver of doubt. Darius and his wife, who, to be honest, I actually couldn't find her name. It looks as though it's never been publicly released, so I'm just going to refer to her as his wife. But they had been married for 8 years. At one point, their relationship hit a rough patch, and this kind of piqued officers' interest. Was there resentment, a secret affair, some long simmering conflict just kind of waiting to get to boiling point? But the more they looked, the more clear it became. That rough patch was bad, but it had ended and they'd moved on. Darius and his wife were now in a good place. In fact, they were in the process of adopting a child. She described her husband as calm, thoughtful, gentle, quote, "He wouldn't harm anybody." And others echoed her, co-workers, friends, even old bandmates from this rock group that he played with on the side. They all thought he was a genuinely nice guy. Quote, "Just a soft-spoken guy who liked guitars and graphic design. No enemies, no feuds, no reason someone would want him dead, let alone tortured and dumped like rubbish in a freezing river." But here's where things get a bit unsettling. Because when someone like Darius is murdered in such a violent, calculated way, and there's no obvious motive, that doesn't usually mean there's no reason, it just means the reason is hidden. And whoever did this was clearly very, very good at hiding things. Anyway, things kind of stalled there. And this is back in 2000. So 34% of reported homicides at this time were cold cases. That's risen to 43% now. But basically, it meant that back then, there was even less focus on solving the cases that went cold. There weren't the resources. And although that number is higher now, we do have dedicated cold case teams, which weren't as much of a thing back in 2000. So this case, Darius's case, stalled for 3 entire years. But his family weren't giving up. They still had real hope for real justice. It was in 2003 that a new detective took an interest in the case. Poland had an 88.8% solve rate for murders. In the US at the same time, it was just over 63%, so you can see that they have a relatively high solve rate comparative to other countries. So this new detective wanted to start working on Darius's case. He just knew there was more to the case than what they'd uncovered so far, and for it to have been sitting cold for 3 years just made no sense to him. And so he took the lead. He trawled through the case files and took note of the facts, and there was this detail that had barely been noticed the first time around. Darius was almost naked. He was wearing nothing but a jumper. No trousers, no shoes, no underwear. But this crime wasn't sexual. There was no sign of abuse in that way. What it was, the detective thought, was humiliation, psychological dominance, power. But power from who was really the question that they were asking, and the answer came from something weirdly small. The detective combed through the original report line by line. Darius's mother, the one who'd answered that mysterious call at the office just hours before he'd vanished, she had said that the caller sounded professional. A man who wanted this custom signage billboard. And he wouldn't give his name, as we know. He just didn't want to speak to anyone apart from Darius. Now, police did think this phone call was important, and so they traced that call to a public phone box just down the street. Creepy, but I guess in 2000, not exactly rare that someone's using a phone box. They did find, though, that less than 1 minute after that call ended, another was made from the same phone booth, and this time to Darius's personal mobile phone. They were obviously from the same person. And here is where the actual, peak clue in this case comes in. A clue that, without it, might have kept this murder, unsolved forever. That detective, relentless, a little bit lucky, and probably just kind of living off of caffeine and stubbornness, he went looking for Darius's missing mobile phone. It hadn't been on the body, and it wasn't at his office, it wasn't in his car or his home, it just disappeared. Now obviously it's been 3 years since this phone was last known to be in Darius's possession, so this is a really hard task, but he believes he can do it. And thankfully, when he was speaking with Darius's widow, he learned something unexpected. She still had the receipt from when Darius had bought the phone, and on it was the serial number. Now, keep in mind, this was the early 2000s. There's no Find My iPhone, no GPS logs, but the detective decided to run the number anyway, just to see if anything came up. And something did. The phone had shown up for sale just 4 days after Darius vanished on this online auction site. It's the kind where you can sell off anything really, like tech, clothes. It's sort of like eBay from my understanding. And here's the thing, with a mobile phone, to be able to list that item, then the seller has to be able to put in the phone's exact serial number. And so that's how they matched it and tracked it down. And the username attached to that listing was Chris B _7. Now, here's where things start to spiral in a way that feels almost scripted. The user had, for some reason, maybe arrogance, maybe laziness, maybe he thought no one would ever check, but he had entered into this website his real identifying information when he was registering the account. I'm guessing this was one of those sites that maybe required verification for electronic sales, something like that. So anyway, that trail led straight to one man, a 30-year-old with a university degree, a complicated personal history, which we'll get to, and a name that would soon become infamous in Poland. Christian Bara. And he was not just some random tech reseller. Christian Bara was a writer, a very specific kind of writer. And one of the stories he had published was going to be key to getting an insight into not only in Christian's mind, but also just how far he was prepared to go to protect what he saw as his. At this point, the detectives didn't have much more than a name, Christian Bara, and they had this shady sale of this murder victim, Darius's phone. But when they researched into Christian, they realised he wasn't even in Poland anymore. After his marriage to a woman called Stasia fell apart, friends said Christian sort of spiralled. He left the country altogether, spending time in the US, drifting around Asia. He taught English, scuba diving, and he lived what looked like from the outside like some kind of nomadic reset. But now, he wasn't just a man on the move, he was a published author. His debut novel was called Amok, and it had earned a bit of attention, not necessarily for being good, exactly, but more for being deeply disturbing. Think like graphic violence, very confusing word games, and misogynistic rants that he sort of tried to dress up as philosophy. It was self-consciously edgy. It was as though Christian wanted to impress readers with just how unfiltered he could be. But the critics weren't impressed, and the detective was very interested. When he Googled the book, just kind of on a whim, past the time in research mode, before he could legally request international cooperation, he found that Christian had been promoting excerpts from Amok on his personal blog. The snippets were strange, sure, but something about the tone felt too close to the real crime. So the detective bought the book, and what he found inside was incredibly telling. The novel's narrator is an angry, egotistical pseudo-intellectual. He's obsessed with dominating others. He hates women. He believes morality is an illusion created by the weak. But it was the plot that really interested the detective. In one scene, the narrator ties up a woman named Mary, beats her, starves her, and eventually kills her, all without remorse. When asked why, the character offers only kind of vague postmodern nonsense about truth being fluid and murder being the, quote, only truly personal act. Specifically, the way he does this killing in the book is that he writes, quote, I pulled the knife and rope from underneath the bed, as if we're about to begin a children's fairy tale. Then I started unwinding this fable of rope, and to make it more interesting, I started to make a noose. It took me 2 million years. I tightened the noose around her neck, holding her down with one hand. With my other hand, I stabbed the knife below her left breast. Everything was covered in blood. End quote. He then ejaculates on her, and in the book, he sells the murder weapon, the knife, online. And he's never caught. Sound familiar? Oh, and also, the protagonist in this book, the narrator, was called Chris, as in Christian, as in the online username Chris used to sell Darius's phone. Chris also says, chillingly, quote, I'm a good liar because I believe the lies myself. There were too many coincidences, too many overlaps. The style of murder, humiliation, starvation, psychological games, it was all eerily similar. The psychological rants in the book were almost identical to some blog posts Christian had written years earlier. And there's been quite a lot of controversy with this case, at least early on before the kind of convictions happened. But at this point in the investigation, they are genuinely worried that obviously the book isn't like a smoking gun. It's not definite, it's not for sure. And just because Christian's written blog posts that are identical to philosophical rants in the book, it doesn't necessarily prove anything. He's authored the book, so of course some of his thoughts are going to be the same, and he's able to get them out in kind of novel form. And the detective knew that he couldn't just arrest someone for writing a weird book, but the moment he finished reading, he was certain Christian Bara wasn't just a suspect. He was obsessed with this murder. So, who was Christian Bara? To understand why the book raised so many flags, the detective really wanted to understand the man behind it. And the deeper he dug, the clearer it became that Christian wasn't just eccentric, he was dangerous. In 1995, Christian married his high school sweetheart, a woman named Stanislava, though he called her Stasia. She dropped out of high school and was working as a secretary. Christian's own mother hated the match. She thought Stasia wasn't good enough for her son. And in time, it seemed maybe Christian started to think this too. Kind of, but at first, things looked okay. In 1997, their son Casper was born. That same year, Christian graduated with top honours and he began a PhD in philosophy. He even landed a full academic scholarship. But it wasn't enough. It seems he was kind of trying to balance doing the PhD and raising a family and kind of providing for them, and he just couldn't do both. So he left that PhD program and instead, he launched his own cleaning business. And in typical Christian fashion, it didn't really go very well, mostly because when the money came in, he spent it. He was very flashy. As soon as he got this money, he wanted to spend it. He wouldn't save for his family or reinvest. And by 2000, he was bankrupt. And alongside this, his marriage was crumbling too. Stasia would later say, quote, The basic problem was women. I knew he was having an affair. But infidelity was just one piece of the puzzle. Christian wasn't just sleeping around, he was constructing myths. Wild, unbelievable stories about himself that he would just repeat until other people believed them. And maybe until he did too. He told his friends he'd had a dangerous love affair in Paris, that he'd narrowly escaped a deadly incident whilst travelling, that he was working on secret projects too brilliant to explain. A former classmate, Rasinki, remembered it well, quote, "He would tell these tall stories about himself. If he told one person, and that person then told someone else who told someone else, it became true. It existed in the language." Christian even had a term for it. He called it mytho-creativity, creating truth by declaring it, rewriting the facts to suit the fantasy. And look, I'm all for manifesting, giving yourself the confidence that you wish you could have so that you have it. But this is taking it to another level. He's outwardly lying. In an email to a friend, he even bragged, quote, "If I ever write an autobiography, it will be full of myths." And then came the book. After the collapse of his business, his marriage, his academic future, Christian threw everything into writing amok. It was violent, chaotic, misogynistic, and in his eyes, a masterpiece. Most bookstores refused to stock it, and he actually had self-published this. Sales were terrible, but Christian didn't care. It really seems that he was convinced it would one day be hailed as absolute genius. He wrote, quote, "I'm truly convinced that one day my book will be appreciated." History teaches that some works of art have to wait ages before they are recognised. To outsiders, it seemed like desperate arrogance, but to those who knew Christian, it was classic him. Delusional self-belief, grandiosity wrapped up in philosophical jargon. What the detective now believed was this. Christian didn't just want to write a novel, he wanted to write the murder that he'd already committed. Anyway, back to the investigation, and the lead detective took the book amok and copied chapters for each of the investigating team. He told them to read through, dig into the words, and look for any kind of leads or clues that could be important or could give them a way to go. And by now, the detective was certain that Christian had done this, he just needed to prove it. But there was a problem. We know Christian was long gone. After his marriage to Stasia collapsed, he'd left Poland entirely. The detective knew that if they tipped their hand too soon, Christian would vanish for good, so they just kind of waited. And he warned his team, quote, "Don't question his friends, don't go near his family, don't do anything that could spook him." Because every now and then, Christian would come home to see his son, to visit old friends, to pretend to be normal for just long enough to keep up appearances. And if they played it right, if they could just stay quiet and patient, then they might get one window, one chance to bring him in. And so, for months, the case went quiet on the outside. But behind closed doors, the cold case team was moving like clockwork. They were mapping out Christian's movements, building timelines, preparing for the moment they could finally put a face to the username ChrisB7. They wanted to put that man behind bars. All they needed now was for Christian Bara to come home. And in the meantime, the investigating team asked a criminal psychologist to analyse the character of Chris, as in Chris in the book. They wanted to do this in order to gain potential insight into Christian, which I actually think is just really smart police work, just to get a bit of an upper hand and knowledge into the kind of person that Christian could be. They're not able to interview him yet, so this is kind of the only information that they can go off of. And again, and this particular quote that I'm going into is from The New Yorker, and I'm just going to quote it exactly because it's an actual expert's report. I don't want to misspeak on it. Quote, "The character of Chris is an egocentric man with great intellectual ambitions. He perceives himself as an intellectual with his own philosophy based on his education and high IQ. His way of functioning shows features of psychopathic behaviour. He is testing the limits to see if he can actually carry out his sadistic fantasies. He treats people with disrespect, considers them to be intellectually inferior to himself, uses manipulation to fulfill his own needs, and is determined to satiate his sexual desires in a hedonistic way. If such a character were real, a true living person, his personality could have been shaped by a highly unrealistic sense of his own worth. It also could be a result of psychological wounds and his insecurities as a man, pathological relationships with his parents, or unacceptable homosexual tendencies. The psychologist acknowledged the links between Christian and Chris, such as divorce, philosophical interests, but did caution that such overlaps were common with novelists, a little bit like I spoke about earlier, and she did warn that basing an analysis of the author on his fictional character would be a gross violation. But to be honest, I don't think they were doing this necessarily as like a slam dunk. They're smart people, they know this isn't going to count as evidence that's like a smoking gun, but what it did do was it really gave them some more information and things they could now look out for whenever they did eventually get to speak with Christian. As the investigation ramped up behind the scenes, the detective went back to the auction site, the one where Darius's phone had been sold just 4 days after he was killed. The login, under the name Chris B _77, that was what the detective used to begin combing through every move Christian made on the site. Every sale, every search, every click. And then he found it. A full month before the murder, Christian had visited the site and searched for a very specific book. Accidental, Suicidal or Criminal Hanging. It was a forensic manual written for police investigators, a guide to help them determine how someone had died, whether a hanging was a suicide or an accident, or a murder. One section stood out. It read, "Hanging a mature, conscious, healthy and physically fit person is very difficult, even for several people." And then it went further, describing in grim detail how to tie a noose. Now, I have to say there was no record of Christian actually buying the book through that site, but that didn't necessarily mean he hadn't gotten it somewhere else. The point was, he'd been researching it before Darius was even dead. It was the first clear indication that what had happened to Darius wasn't necessarily random or spur of the moment. It wasn't spontaneous, it was orchestrated. Remember back kind of near the start of the case, I spoke about the suspicious phone calls that came into the office the last day Darius was alive. Well, we know detectives managed to trace those phone calls to that public telephone box. They also managed to determine that the calls were made with this card, and each card was embedded with a unique number that registered with the phone company whenever it was used. They managed to basically trace all of the telephone numbers dialed with that same card. Over a 3-month period, 32 calls had been made. They included calls to Christian's parents, his girlfriends, his friends, and a business associate. So it was incredibly clear that whoever, Christian, had used that card to call his friends, his girlfriend, business associate, they had also used that card to call Darius's office and Darius's mobile phone on the day he disappeared. It wasn't long after all of that Christian finally returned to Poland. Detectives had been waiting, watching, and when they saw their chance, they took it. He was near a drugstore when they moved in and arrested him. Now, in true Christian fashion, he later wrote about this moment, but the version he gave was wild, dramatic, almost definitely made up. He claimed that he was tackled to the ground, manhandled by a swarm of officers. It was something like out of a movie, the way he described it. But the lead detective later confirmed that none of that was true. There was no scuffle, no resistance, even by Christian himself. They arrested him without incident. And so, soon after that, the detective was sitting across the table from Christian, face to face, finally ready to ask him the question that had been haunting the case for years. How did he get hold of Darius's mobile phone? Christian paused, then shrugged. He said he couldn't remember. It was 5 years ago. Then he changed tack, said he must have bought it secondhand from a shop. He'd done that before. But here's the thing, there was no record of that purchase. No evidence at all that he bought the phone from a store. Just his word. And considering everything else detectives had uncovered, that just wasn't going to be enough. They also did a polygraph. Some of the questions were, did you know Darius? Were you in the place where Darius was held hostage? Just before Darius lost his life, did you know this would happen? Were you the one who killed him? Do you know who actually murdered him? He said no to every single one of those questions, but the results came back as inconclusive. Even with everything I've spoken about up to this point, all they really had on Christian was circumstantial. The mobile phone, sure, he sold it on the internet, but he claimed he bought it secondhand. The polygraph was inconclusive. The book on hangings, he never actually purchased it. He just looked it up. And the novel, Amok, it was disturbing for sure, and there were eerie similarities, but it wasn't a confession, not technically. The detective had no motive, no witness, no confession. So in the end, they could only charge Christian with selling stolen property, Darius's phone, and this other completely unrelated offence. He walked free. Well, mostly free. His passport was confiscated to stop him from vanishing overseas again. But then there was this one odd little detail. Polish police had previously featured Darius's case on a national TV show. I actually couldn't find it to watch it, but from what I understand, it's something a bit like Crime Watch, what we'd have here. It asks viewers to come forward with tips, and that segment was uploaded to the show's website. When investigators looked through the website traffic logs, they noticed something strange. There were visitors from the United States, Japan, South Korea. Totally random and unexpected. This wasn't the kind of traffic they would usually get. But then they realised that those countries matched exactly with Christian's passport stamps. Wherever he was going, he was checking in on the case. This was not a coincidence, but it also wasn't enough to prove murder either. So now police were left in this really frustrating place. They knew he was involved. They knew that they needed to put him away, but they just couldn't prove it yet. It's really interesting, actually. There's quite a lot of information and detail on Christian, especially the view that people had on him. There was a lot of positivity around him. He was seen by his friends or ex-girlfriends as interesting and bright and intelligent. And there's even a teaching reference spoken about, and this was from around the time of the murder. I'm going to quote it exactly. With no reservation, I highly recommend Christian Bara for any teaching position with children. But there were also loads that were contradicting to that, like speaking about his vulgarity and infidelity in terms of like what his friends said about him. One person that hadn't spoken to police yet was Christian's ex-wife, Stasia. It turned out that the summer of 2000, Stasia went to a nightclub called Crazy Horse, and she confirmed that at Crazy Horse, she had met Darius. They spent the entire night talking. She said that he gave her his phone number. Later, they went on a date and checked into a hotel, but before anything happened, she said he admitted that he was married, and so she left. Quote, "Since I know what it's like to be a wife whose husband betrays her, I didn't want to do that to another woman." We of course know about that bad patch in Darius's marriage and how they had then patched things up, but this was obviously before that. And so it seems that after he'd gotten home, he and his wife had patched things up. That was kind of it in terms of his and Stasia's connection. They never saw each other again. Several weeks after that date though, Christian showed up at Stasia's place in a drunken rage, demanding that she admit to having an affair with Darius. He broke down the front door and hit her. He shouted that he had hired a private detective and knew everything. And I did wonder, until I read that line, I was like, how has he done this? How has he got all of this information, considering that they met once and then went on one singular date? But it kind of makes sense if he's hired professional help, which also makes me question the kind of control he had over her and how obsessed he was with everything that she did. He also mentioned that he'd visited Darius's office and he described it to her. He even knew which hotel they went to. This kind of controlling nature and the character of Christian was reinforced by testimonies of witnesses who observed how Christian had angry outbursts when he saw Stasia talking to other men, specifically a time when she was talking to another man at a New Year's Eve party in 2000. According to those testimonies, Christian was shouting to the man that he would get rid of him and that he had already done it once, quote, using a rope. And it was with that connection the detectives believed they finally had enough evidence. Christian was arrested and the case went to trial. It started on February 22nd, 2007. The prosecution claimed Christian had murdered Darius in a fit of jealous rage. The judge herself had admitted that she was not sure if Christian had carried out the crime alone or with an accomplice. It was concluded that Christian had lured Darius out of his office, imprisoned him for at least 3 days, during which Darius was beaten and starved, as well as bound, stunned, and thrown into that river. And given all of the evidence, including the forensic technology, the jury found him guilty. And he appealed that conviction. Now, although the appeals panel found an undoubted connection between Christian and the murder, it actually concluded that there were still gaps in the logical chain of evidence, things like the medical examiner's conflicting testimony, and that needed to be resolved. The panel refused to release him from prison, but they did order a retrial. That took place in 2009, and again, he was found guilty and he was resentenced to 25 years. Christian continued to say he was innocent, saying he'd been set up, although he didn't know who by and he didn't really have any theories. Christian was so desperate to be seen as an artist, as a genius, he said about his book, quote, "There's going to be a new edition coming out with an afterword about the trial and all the events that have happened. Other countries are interested in publishing it as well. There's never been a book quite like this." He even said he was working on a sequel to Amok, but that was 20 years ago, that quote that I found from him, and I actually haven't seen anything else reported on it since. Oh, and one thing I hadn't spoken about yet, but it's kind of chilling. When detectives searched Christian's computer, they found something very telling. He'd been gathering information, not about Darius this time, but about a man called Harry, Stasia's new boyfriend. A note on the screen read, "Single, 34 years old, his mom died when he was 8, apparently works at the railway company, probably as a train driver, but I'm not sure." It was personal, and to detectives, it looked like Harry might be Christian's next victim. He was sussing him out. He'd even found out that Harry had visited an internet chat room, and under a fake name, Christian had posted a message there. "Sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for Harry. Does anyone know him from Choi now?" He was fishing. It was clear he wasn't just watching from the sidelines. He was inserting himself again, reaching out, getting close. And it suggested something terrifying. Darius might not have been a one-off. Christian Bara might have been preparing to kill again. Thankfully, the police caught him and he was obviously sent to prison, but like I mentioned, I just couldn't find any super up-to-date info about him today in 2025. His first trial was in 2007, so he's got at least a few years left in his minimum sentence. But of course, if anything comes out about him in the meantime, I will update you guys. And that is the story of Darius Januszewski and Christian Bara.